When we think of the writing process behind great love songs, we imagine artists sitting behind a piano, agonizing, putting their head in their hands, staring at a blank page, crafting each line, each note, lovingly, with a specific singer in mind, a ballad written for one voice, tailored to the singer's personality, destined to be a hit. Now I want you to think of Motown, the production studio that churned out the most prolific love songs in America. Ain't No Mountain High Enough, Tracks of My Tears, Stop in the Name of Love, Please Mr. Postman, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch, literally scores of number one hits between 1961 and 1997. And it was accomplished through creative competition and snatching those lovingly crafted ballads out of the hands of the creators. When Berry Gordy started Motown, he based its process on the Detroit auto factories. He saw what production lines, competitive design, and iteration can do for the final product, and he brought that to music. Up until Berry Gordy, everyone had taken the tortured artist approach to music. The lone writer bent over the piano, desperately penning the next hit. Berry Gordy saw it differently. He made writers go head to head to see who would compose the best hit for the singer. He encouraged artists to outdo each other week by week. He held meetings where his creative team voted for which songs they liked the best. And if a composition didn't fit one singer, he'd send it down the assembly line to the next one to see what they could do with it. When Smokey Robinson, Berry's friend and mentee, created the smash hit My Guy, Berry and the Motown team challenged Smokey to do it again. 6 months later, the team recorded My Girl with the Temptations. In the incredible documentary Hitsville, The Making of Motown, Smokey says this about working under Berry Gordy and his atmosphere of competition. Quote, to be in there with a bunch of guys you're competing with, and yet they're constructively giving you information that could help you. It's cutthroat, but constructive. As the captain of his ship, Berry Gordy wasn't exempt from the competition either. Gordy himself put songs he had written against Smokey Robinson's biggest hits to be voted on by his team, and he often lost gratefully. Competition breeds champions, Berry Gordy says, but you can't let competition get in the way of the love. You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Laments, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no duh on the internet and get us to the facts.
As creative individuals, we want to feel total control over how our work gets interpreted. If we paint a picture, we want to say and where it's hung. If we cook a meal, we want to determine the wine it's paired with. If we write an amazing PowerPoint, we want to pick the slides. But according to Berry Gordy, creative competition lets us innovate. It exposes us to outside talent and opinions, which results in better end product. So today, we're tackling 3 myths about getting competitive. Myths like: Myth 1. Some people are born competitive, some aren't. If you're not a competitive personality, then that's just the way you were built. Myth 2. Competition makes people aggressive and mean. So what good could come out of making everything into a competition? Myth 3. But what if I like being a warrior rather than a competitor? And what about the differences between men and women in competition? Aren't we still taught in school that women aren't as competitive as men? But first, I want to tell Joe how Berry Gordy was so into creative competition, his first step to success was recruiting and mentoring his own greatest rival.
So, Todd, I recognize the songs you were reading, the ones from our narrative intro. All of them are really catchy, and I know them from movies. They came from Motown. What is Motown?
It's funny you brought that up. We're talking offline that these are songs that were written before we were born.
Right.
And we know every note of them.
Yeah, magically. I think it is because I've heard so many in movies. Like, they really just sort of like, they encapsulate the generation they came from.
Well, when Berry Gordy bought Hitsville in 1959, that was the original Motown headquarters. And it wasn't like a big studio. It was this cramped little photography studio in Detroit. And he converted it into a recording studio.
Okay.
Now, I want to just tell everyone some of the groups that came out of Motown. And I don't have time to go over all of the artists and all of the hit songs. There's just too many. But I'm going to give you a few. Marvin Gaye, The Supremes, The Temptations, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, The Jackson 5, Gladys Knight, Lionel Richie, and there's a lot more.
So a couple names there that some people might recognize.
Now, there were a lot of other bigger record companies around. They were a tiny flea on the wall. They were not a big company, but they just seemed to find talent and develop it. They took people that were already great musicians and with their system brought them to a whole new level. Now, Berry Gordy was a very interesting man. He grew up in Detroit. This was his hometown. And he knew at a very young age to invest in himself. And he was very self-aware. He made an observation as a very young, as a child. He said that people are all the same. It's an even playing field. He says, if I stub my toe or you stub your toe, whether I'm rich, poor, black, white, we all feel the same.
So that translates to music then. Like if we all feel love the same way, then anyone's going to enjoy the music.
Well said. Now, Berry Gordy's mission was, and this was his system, he said, his brand, I guess you would say, is find, sign, develop. Now, Berry was a songwriter, but he was also an entrepreneur, and he owned a small record store. Now, the record store went out of business. He wasn't a really good businessman. He was having some problems relating to customers. So he had to go out and get what we call a real job, right?
Right. We both watched the same documentary. We mentioned at the top of the show that it was Hitsville, the making of Motown. One of my favorite parts of the documentary is that he had a problem selling records because he didn't want to sell the bad ones.
Yeah, and the customers would beg to buy them. And he would say, no, we don't sell that crap here.
Right. He's a bit of a snoot or snob.
Stubborn.
That's a better way of putting it.
Yeah. So he kicked customers out of his store until the store went out of business. So, and that was an aha moment for him because he had to go work down at Ford plant in Berry, Detroit. And he observed in how they built the cars and the structure of them, how they started with a frame and added an engine. And he thought, man, I can do this with the people. I can do this with music.
Oh, so like the assembly line system.
Exactly. So he said, we'll find the talent. We'll write them songs. We'll get them to sing the songs with the musicians. He had it all blueprinted out.
Okay.
And it looked very, because again, we think of creative things. We think a bottle of wine up in the mountains.
Right.
He made it very industrial. Everybody laughed at him when he was telling people his ideas. Other musicians, other songwriters said, you can't do that with people. People aren't machines. And he said, I'm not going to treat them like machines. I'm going to treat them like people. Now, something that was life-changing, and this was inspiring to me, was Berry Gordy's story about when he met Smokey Robinson. That changed his life. He said he would never have been successful like he was if he hadn't met Smokey.
Oh, wow. That's high praise.
Yeah, he wasn't an established writer yet, but he had written some songs that had been released. And Smokey knew who he was because he wrote a song that he really liked. So when they first met, Barry, he jokes about this. He said, I made a mistake. I asked Smokey if he had any songs written.
Oh.
He hands him this monster folder, hundreds of songs, Joe, and hands it to him and say, here you go. And Barry looks at these and he shakes his head and he says, you rhyme really well. It's great rhymes, but your songs don't make any sense. They need to be in a story. There needs to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. He said, let me teach you structure. He said, because if you keep writing like this, you'll never be successful.
The man after my own heart.
Now, Smokey never really thought that he had much of a chance to be successful. So he says if he never would have met Barry, he had a very poor upbringing and just didn't think that he was ever going to better his lot in life. He did love to perform and sing, but he didn't have very high expectations. But after he met Barry, and Barry made these adjustments, he became, in everyone's opinion at Motown, all these great writers, musicians, the greatest of all time, they all say Smokey Robinson was the greatest writer that ever lived.
Wow. And it was this competitive partnership that did it.
These two together have been best friends for over 50 years. And they all say the same thing. They have the same motto: competition and love.
Beautiful. Well, do you want to start getting into the science of competition?
Yes, sir.
So one of the things I wanted to look at first when we were watching this documentary is how much do we actually compete? Like naturally, because when I was watching it, I was like, these guys are insane. Like putting their songs against each other. Songs to me are they're subjective. You either like it or you don't. There's no measure for it. There's not like a metric that will tell you this one is objectively better, except I guess sales, right? So I was trying to think, how do we show that we're all competitive? That on some level, every one of us listening, because I myself, I'm not like into sports. I think people that listen to this podcast probably know that. And you're quite competitive as a personality, right?
Yeah, from playing sports is one of the big ones.
Okay. Is there another avenue in life where you feel you're equally as competitive?
I'd say public speaking.
Okay. We will, that'll be a tease because we will talk about how Todd and I met and bonded over sort of a competition of sorts. So I was looking for... and
I know what yours is. Let me cut you off here.
Oh, go ahead.
What are you competitive in?
Writing. Absolutely. So I used to think I wasn't competitive until I started doing that. And I bet you everybody listening has something in life where they are competitive. I mean, it could just be video games, or it could be like they want to have the best, cover letter or something, or they need to have a better PowerPoint than everybody in the office.
Well, and I'll bring this up to everyone who will listen, that I played sports my whole life growing up. After, as I got adult, I took some acting classes and got involved in, I did some Shakespeare and some other plays. And I found out that the arts, to me, are way more competitive, Joe, than sports.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. You have never seen competition until you sit in on an artistic critique. They are tearing each other apart. So even past that, I'm still betting we might have a couple of people who still think they're not competitive. So I want to talk about the fundamental level of basically living in any society, any society that uses money, a capitalist society. So this study comes from this is from the Harvard School of Public Health, and also from the article we got it from was The Atlantic in the titled "Why We Compete." And in this study, they went around to students and faculty, and they just surveyed everybody they could at the Harvard School. And they asked, what I'm going to ask you, Todd, would you prefer to live in a world where the average salary was $25,000 a year, and you earn 50, so you earn double what everybody else does year by year on average? Or would you rather live in a world where you earned 100,000, but everyone else earns 200,000?
I'm weak. I'll say the first one. I'd rather be richer than everybody else.
Okay. So you would rather have far less money, but comparatively to your neighbors, you have more, rather than the average goes up. You are very much in the majority with that. When they went around and they surveyed people, they found out most participants would rather live in a world where their neighbors made less than them, and they made more than their neighbors, but less in total, than being the small fish in the big world where everybody makes more. And that to me kind of became like the building block of my understanding of competition. Like for this episode, I was like, okay, so fundamentally we're all at least competing for resources, not for the sake of resources. Not like we're all sort of like collecting shells and the person with the most shells wins. It's, oh, I just need to beat my neighbor.
Right. You don't need to have the biggest house, the mansion, and the Ferrari. You just need to have the nicest house of all your coworkers.
Exactly. We can all be snails in our shells, but my shell needs to be shinier and bigger than yours.
It's hard being human, isn't it?
Oh, yes. So every time we cover episodes, that's what I end up thinking at the end. It's like, wow, we are all kind of predictable, and we're all tough on each other. There's also a 1947 study by Richard Easterlin, and this has become known as the Easterlin paradox, and it basically just says the same thing. Easterlin was an economist, and he found out that as countries become richer, its citizens do not necessarily become happier. And when he got into the study, he found out that when everyone gets richer, at the same time, at the same rate, no one gets happier. They may get more healthy, they may get more education as they grow, but they will not be necessarily happier. Later, a study of British citizens, 1,200 British citizens, found the same thing. That basically, happiness only increased when it was the income was higher than peers of the same age, education level, and region. So basically it was they're only happy if their neighbors are lower in income than they are. Todd also reminded me that we covered a bit of this in our Hollywood Expectations episode, where they found out that the max happiness, Gallup polls found that the max happiness for income level is about 95,000 per year. And above 105,000, happiness actually goes down a bit.
Now that one was shocking to me, because I figured if you made 400 grand, you'd be 4 times happier than someone who makes 100 grand.
So if you make over 105,000, you have to do it around neighbors who make less than that. That's the only way it increases happiness from there on. So sort of speaking of income level and like happiness compared to neighbors, we kind of dug in a little bit with the research and found out that neighbors sometimes get competitive with each other and they produce better products. Like Motown wasn't only a fluke of neighbors getting together and starting a competition. Can you share with us a couple more of those?
I got a few. Now, one of my favorite ones, and when we started writing this episode, there's a big influencer, social media influencers down in Los Angeles, and they all live in the same apartment complex. Now they're all kind of competing for the same. They're the mid-20s. They're looking for the same kind of people, the same kind of followers, same kind of promotions. They actually produce the same YouTube videos with different content and just use their spin on it. And all of them have just flourished and blown up because of it.
Did they move in together? In this apartment complex, they sought each other out?
They're all in this big complex, and they'll be shooting their videos in the quad down there, or they'll go over to each other's apartment and exchange ideas, exchange audio equipment, help each other with editing. Very similar to Motown.
That's kind of awesome.
Well, and then there's the rap group, MWA. All of those members came out of the same neighborhood. They all had a special, one guy was Ice Cube was the writer, and Dre was the producer, and Easy was the rapper. And they all kind of got in their lane and did what they did best. Dr. Dre took that, and then he went and recruited all these other musicians to come live with him, and he'd give them their beats, and so that's continued.
Wow. So basically the rap Motown.
Now, this one was an interesting one. Okay, I'm talking about NASA. NASA astronauts.
Okay.
Now, in the history of our country, there's only been 355 people who can say, who dead or alive, can say that they're an astronaut. So some guy in a bar is telling you he's an astronaut, Joe. There's probably a good chance he's not.
Probably not one of those 100 or 355, right?
But for some reason, the state of Ohio has had 21 of them. and Cleveland, which is the second largest city in that state, has 8 out of that area. So for some reason, Cleveland and Ohio produces the most astronauts.
I was going to make a joke like, what's in the water? But then I was like, maybe they're just really bored and staring up at the sky all the time.
The only thing I could find was the Wright brothers. That's where they originally started building their glider airplanes back in the day. But
okay. I can't help but get the feeling, though, that you're going to tell me that if I had been born in Cleveland, Ohio, I may not have been an astronaut just by default. Is there some other qualifications besides being born in the right place?
There is. It's called hard work.
Oh.
I know, right? This sucks. But it's not enough just to surround yourself with talent. You have to be a perfectionist. You have to get your competition into honing your skill.
Okay.
Now, Smokey was complaining that Berry would remix his song 32 times to the point of just exhausting, trying every single mix of it, a different version of the song.
Mm-hmm.
And what would infuriate Smokey was, after he tortured them night after night with all these remixes, 32 of them, he would use the second one for the song. and Berry would say, very calmly and very coolly, very humbly, sometimes you have it perfect and you just want to get it better.
I like that. So we have a little bit of experience with that. Do you remember the Stephen King episode?
Oh, yeah. Tell me, refresh my memory.
Okay. So we have never talked about this on the podcast, but we had an episode about Stephen King and alcoholism and how, writers might have alcoholic brains. We recorded that. I believe we recorded it, sat and agonized over it while we were recording, cutting it. And then we finished it, wrapped, I edited it, and then once we started actually doing the last audio edit, it had all these weird pops and noises. And so we, even though it was perfectly fine, like we used a tool that would filter it, it was just a tad quiet. Not horrendous to listen to, not a bother. But we, even though it took us about 4 hours to record that one, we sat down and we're like, no, quiet is not good enough. And we redid the entire episode. So if you've heard that episode, that's the second time we sat and recorded the whole thing again.
And we agonized over it because we'd put so much into this baby. We didn't want to kill it.
Right.
We put our heart and soul into that. We're thinking, we got to do it again.
Right.
I'm so glad we did, though, because it just wasn't up to our standard.
Well, it also proved to me that we're both crazy enough and willing to sit and torture ourselves again for that amount of time. So I was happy with that. Do you want to talk about the speeches?
Yeah, I want to talk about how Joe and I first met. We were in a Toastmasters club, and he was just a lights-out evaluator and speaker. And we were in the same club for a while, and we started to have breakfast meetings, and I asked him to be my mentor, and I was going to be his mentee. And much like Smokey Robinson and Berry Gordy, I had all these ideas, and they didn't make any sense. So we'd go to this breakfast place once or twice a week, and we'd push all these tables together. And Joe was teaching me structure because he's a world-class fantasy writer. And we would just start going through all these ideas and putting them together, to the point that people at other tables would stop eating and listening to us. And we're like, shit, we might be onto something. So that's how the Re-Engineered You was born.
And just so I can reveal a little tiny bit more, we were preparing for a competition. It was a Toastmasters speech competition we were preparing for, and that's one of the speeches we assembled. We assembled a lot of them, but yeah, that was a great time. The iteration, exactly what we're talking about, perfectionism and iteration.
And I took my speech that Joe rewrote, that we honed and honed and honed. It did very well in the competition, better than I'd done previously for years. It took me to a whole new level.
It was great. I was very proud.
Now, I want to talk to you about how obsessive Berry and Smokey were. It's 3 a.m. in the morning one night. Phone rings. Smokey Robinson's woken up. And Berry says, "Chaperone won't let me sleep." The song. Mm-hmm. They'd already recorded this song. The song had already been released. It was already out on vinyl.
Oh, so the genie was out of the bottle.
Yeah. And so Berry says, "Oh, it's me, Smokey." And Smokey Robinson sarcastically says, "Yeah, I know your voice. It's 3 a.m.
Right.
And he insisted he wanted to perfect it. He wanted to put the genie back in the bottle. He wanted to figure out how he could make this song, even though it was released, better.
Wow.
Now, Chaperone became Motown's first major hit after they redid it. Now, one thing that really stuck out to me in my corporate job is Berry talked about how important meetings were. You know, I usually think of meetings, Joe, I don't know about you, as just time wasters, time burglars.
You dodge them if you can. You get out of them. Do anything to leave.
He would have these meetings, and what I noticed about listening on them, because we listened to a lot of the recorded ones, everyone had equal say. It wasn't him up there just telling everybody what they think, that they have to agree with him. He wanted them to push back on him. He took criticism well.
So not something a lot of like bosses and CEOs would be doing?
No, and the love and mutual respect that Smokey and Berry have for each other is beautiful. It's not uncommon. They brag about the other one. They look up to the other one. They want to be better than them, but they still can acknowledge how great they are. They don't have to knock them down.
That's awesome. So it's the building up type of competition.
And I'm going to keep saying it again, competition and love. And what Smokey says is, if you take out the love, you have ego, jealousy, and that kills everything.
Beautiful. So do you want to discuss a little bit on how to find the right kind of competition according to science? Excellent. So I wanted to find out if a big company contest was going to produce results. Like, has your company ever done a thing where it's like the salesman of the month, or, you know, if everyone puts $1 into a jar, and if everybody competes, the winner gets to keep all the money?
Yeah, well, we used to have like weekly sales goals where you can get as much as $1,000, a couple grand.
Right. I was trying to find out how many people you can compete with before it becomes overwhelming, before like, oh, my mind can't handle competing against thousands, or if it was better to have like a single competitor, like a rival. And that's actually what I found. We found a really good article. It's called "How Competition Affects Your Brain" by Lisa Evans, and she talked about a study, or she referenced a study. This was by the doctor was Jalene Grover Seaver, and she ran sort of a study with archers, and she found out that when people doing archery, when they compete and they had a rival, like they had one person specifically they were trying to outdo, kind of like Smokey and Berry here, they found out that they would score higher even when their competitor wasn't present. So it wasn't just they scored higher. Having a rival in general in life made them more competitive.
That nemesis, that golf nemesis.
Yeah. You have to be able to imagine, like, you think of them on the line with you as if they're like, as if they're standing next to you ready to compete against you, and it gives you that edge.
Now, for any of our PDX listeners, it's not uncommon to see Joe Anthony walking through your neighborhood with a bow and arrow.
That is actually right. I shoot a recurve bow, and I've been doing it for years. And I used to have a friend. I would go up and there's an archery range, a legit archery range up near the Oregon Zoo. And I used to go up there and compete against a friend of mine. I won't say his name. But he would magically get better as soon as we were shooting against each other. It was, best score, the worst score buys the first round of beers. And normally I scored higher than him. As soon as there was beer on the line, he smoked me. Like, he would just instantly get better.
So this is right for him and you. That's right.
Exactly. Yeah, we had that Smokey and Gordy thing going on. And pretty much everyone can do the same thing. Like, if you are in a sales job, if you work in an office, if you have any skills that you're trying to hone, find someone who's trying to do it too. Even if you're just going to the gym, find somebody who is like around your same weight and class, and see if you can compete. And
that's what workout partners for at the gym. If my buddy bench presses 225 7 times, I can't do it twice. I'm going to try to do at least 8.
Right. And you may not be in the exact same skill set or the exact same weight as somebody else, but you will be a little more competitive just to try to keep up with somebody who's ahead of you.
You'll find that body part that you're stronger than them at.
Exactly. You'll show off when you're at the squat rack. In total, this comes from a 2009 study by Stefan Garcia. It showed that when there are fewer players, people compete better. And when students competed on quizzes, they were short quizzes, the top 20% who completed it fastest and most accurately, they told them they'd receive $5 for the top 20%. The students competed better, and they completed it more accurately when it was against 10 other students rather than 100. And the difference was pretty significant.
This makes a lot of sense to me. If you're thinking about like a valedictorian of a high school, you can't compete with all the local high schools, but you can compete with those 4 or 5 kids that you've been in honor classes with all these years. You know who they are.
Exactly. If you can look at somebody and say, oh, that's Teresa. I know how good she is at math. Or I know Bob over here, he's great at I'm going to hose him at like science. You have to be able to pick people out and say, here's where I'm strong. Yeah, exactly.
I know their weak spot.
And then, of course, finally, we have one last little bit of advice. If you have coworkers or friends who they don't like losing, like it hurts, like they don't compete ever because it's just like it's too painful to think of losing, you can get them into competition, not by directly competing with them, but just set up challenges for them. They might like little achievements. They might like little things that they can sort of reach for, especially in the business world.
Some softballs.
Exactly. Give them some softball challenges. Get them into it. Something else I was thinking about, too, is when we encourage people to compete in business, we kind of like capitalism as an American system is supposed to be competitive, right? So I was thinking, do you have any good examples of businesses that haven't competed or haven't had to compete?
Or miss just obvious things? I got a couple. One of them that jumped out at me this week, working on this show, was, the money transferring service PayPal.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all the major banks, the Wells Fargos, the Chase, the Keys, they could have set up that technology years ago. There was an obvious need for this. Western Union had been doing it for years. They totally ignored it until PayPal just kind of knocked them on their ass.
I hadn't thought about that, yeah, but any bank could have literally done the exact same setup.
Yeah, and they could have done it a lot cheaper than they could. Another one was Blockbuster. I don't know if anybody remembers when Friday night you go down to Blockbuster and you hope they have those new releases. Well, they were told about this new thing, Redbox, and they thought it was stupid. They thought, who would do that when you can come stand in line at our store?
Right. You want to have people sneezing on you in line at Blockbuster, and you want people jumping in front of you and grabbing the movie before you can. Like, that's the fun of Blockbuster, right?
Yeah, and they just totally ignored all competition. Now, there's a new trend in the NBA. Now, all these mega teams, you can't just have one good star player, and that's what it used to be. You have one good star player, and everyone supports them. The teams that really thrive now, Joe, get multiple all-stars, superstars, and then they bring everybody's talent up. They expect more of the other players. They bring those stars, their stats up too. They score more points, they get more rebounds, they get more steals when they have a better player than them on the team.
So just having like a couple of really good competitors, people who are competing with you on the same team, that's all it takes. It brings everybody up.
Absolutely. Now you see this with all the rappers. What do they do on social media? What do they do to get more famous or to make better songs?
Beefs.
That's right. They start beefs with other musicians. They write songs about how much they're better and richer than they are. And then they write, another song back that they're more street cred.
Right.
Now I'm going off on this other rant now. So let me get back to our story. Motown, okay?
Please.
Okay, so early in Motown's career, Berry Gordy and his team discovered that they couldn't out-funk the jazz musicians in Detroit. They just couldn't do it. They were bringing all these musicians at her, but these jazz musicians, these old-schooled, played 7 nights a week in the clubs, were just playing better. They played to more tougher crowds. They had more experience. They had more reps. But Berry didn't try to run away from the competition. He went out and he hired them.
Oh, smart.
Yeah, even though they didn't play the same kind of music, he realized that they weren't getting enough money at these clubs. So he could hire them for more money and they could come play and work for him.
So it wasn't just creative competition for him. He was competitively hiring people too.
And I think it's important to point out that Detroit at this time was a melting pot for talented musicians. The motor business, the auto industry, was bringing a lot of people from the Southeast. And so what you had, this perfect environment in Detroit of churches, nightclubs, and music. Everybody loved music. So it was creating just awesome musicians.
So it was basically a town of people with their own individual musical rivalries going on at the same time.
That's right. And some of the writers said that if you couldn't sing and dance, you wouldn't fit in at school. Everybody could sing and dance.
Wow.
So the standard for Motown or for Detroit, Motor City, was just higher than it was the rest of the world. Now at the height of Motown, every corner, every room of the studio, someone was writing, working. So 22 hours a day, around the clock. The hits kept coming out, Joe. It's because of that Motown structure.
The assembly line.
That's right, the blueprint. Now Berry Gordy, the businessman, the perfectionist Joe, was always trying to get a better sound. And this was something that all the top execs argued about all the time. They go back and forth. And what all the musicians were saying was, our sound is awesome. We're selling. These studios from New York and LA are sending musicians to us because they want to sound like us. So why do we change? But Berry couldn't let it go. He wanted to get better. He didn't see a success and just rest on it. He said, we can even sound better. We can do better.
So almost competing against himself at that point.
Absolutely.
Well, I was wondering, because we've sort of drilled home the importance of competition, can we address like the elephant in the room, which
Please.
is what if I am not like genetically built to compete?
Oh, not good enough.
Right. Like
Can
I don't
never
have it
win.
in me.
Don't waste your time.
Right, exactly. And also the one that you mentioned at the top of the show, which is, are women built to compete? Are they told, not to compete? Is it how much of it is genetic? How much of it is raising women to be less competitive? So for this, I found a pretty good source. There is a book called Top Dog: The Science of Winning and Losing by Poe Bronson and Ashley Merriman. And it's utterly fascinating. You can find podcasts where they talk about this. They've got articles out. It's really great, and they have written several books about competition. So this is kind of their jam. So one of the things they talk about is how dopamine works in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that does planning, thinking, memory, and adapts to all of those things. They found out that there is an enzyme or a gene variant that handles enzymes, and it will determine whether somebody is what they put it, and I love this phrasing, a worrier or a warrior. And quick question, which one do you think you are?
I'm a warrior, man.
You're a warrior?
What about you? You're a warrior.
No, I worry, and that's how I compete. Is I worry so much that I hone whatever I'm working on until until it's way overdone. So they found out that worriers, the people that worry themselves sick, they have higher levels of dopamine, just generally speaking, in their brain. But when they get stressed, their brains get overloaded. So the worrier freezes up, basically. Whereas warriors generally don't have enough dopamine. So day to day, they're more lethargic. You ever met those guys, like real competitive sports guys, where they, like, when you see them like in the ring or when you see them doing their sport, they're active, like they seem like they're on fire. Mm-hmm. And then afterward, they're like a lizard on a hot rock. Like they can barely be, they can barely be moved.
Yeah, they're flowing. They're doing what they're born to do.
Right, exactly. So there is actually like a hard component to whether or not you worry or you're a warrior. But you can train yourself to be either. You honestly can. From this article, they're saying that if you are a worrier, you can train specifically for managing stress during times of stress, and you can become accustomed to that particular brand of stress and manage it better.
So you find that thing that you genuinely love that you do even if you weren't getting paid, and then you're going to become a warrior in that.
Yes, exactly. Train yourself to stress manage in the moment, and then you won't freeze up as much. Now we're going to get to the part where we're probably going to get criticized online. Are you ready for that part?
Oh, boy. I don't want to make women angry at me, Joe. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
Hell hath no fury like an angry internet and a woman scorned. So by the way, we did not write this research. We are just talking about it. So if you want to drag us, you can drag them first. So from the same book, they talked about how the conventional wisdom is that women, they're not as competitive. Like they're not taught to be, or they're not genetically built to be competitive. So one of the studies they looked at in this, they wanted to see if that was true, first off. They just wanted to see if women are less competitive. And one of the examples they used was they studied state legislators. And they went to female state they went to all state legislators, and they did surveys to find out if they were planning to run again. So after their first term, if they were going to run a second time. They found out that most of the women in their studies, if they knew they had a better than 20% chance to win, they would actually run. And the higher their percentage chance to win, like the higher they told them their percent would be, the more likely they were to run. So basically, if I'm going to win, I will run. The men, however, there was almost no relation to their chances versus whether or not they'd run again.
This totally reminds me of if there's a job opening, women have to fit what they're asking for. It's something like 70-80% before they'll apply. Mm-hmm. Men, it's like less than 10%.
Yeah, they'll apply to anything.
They think that, I'm cool, I can do all those things. But women will measure it and say, I want to make sure that I'm a good fit for this.
I am so glad you said that, because we're about to get into specifically like jobs and whether or not people are qualified and how this plays into that. So overall, men are bigger risk takers. They're more overconfident and they're less interested in their own odds. That goes into jobs and job interviews. So another thing they looked at in this book was Wall Street job interviews at Wall Street, and they found out that one of the jobs there is a Wall Street analyst. Only about 16% of Wall Street analysts are women. However, the women doing those jobs, on average, are 7% more accurate at the job.
They're smarter and they're harder workers.
Yes,
and we need more of them, but they're not applying.
Exactly, and you would think, well, 7% efficiency at a job is usually huge, But this is being an analyst, so they're handling other people's money. So 7% is massive on Wall Street. Wall Street is built on little percentages here and there. They found that these women also use the same realism and realistic expectations in their own job interviews. So when they would interview, they would actually say what their qualifications are. They would actually state truthfully what they were able to do, and they wouldn't fib as much.
And I'm guessing that men lie their asses off.
The men, like you said, they would apply for the position basically regardless of what their qualifications were. If they were in the ballpark, then they would apply for it.
That's me. I've applied for jobs I have no business.
Have you also heard the myth that women aren't as good at math?
No, I'm not even going to say that out loud.
Okay.
I'm so scared right now. We might not release this.
We're both sweating bullets. Now, this also came from the study, so I feel confident about this.
Okay.
So, again, a guy feels confident about something he's not qualified to judge, so that shouldn't surprise anyone.
We're totally full of it.
Yeah. They found that in high school AP calculus tests, if they put the desired school of choice, also known as basically the box you fill out where it's like, what school is this intent for? Like, we're going to send your test to the school after you take it, your school of choice, where you want to, graduate and go to. They found out that by taking that box, that fill out section, and putting it to the back of the test instead of the front, many more girls passed the test.
Because the stakes weren't so high.
Because they weren't reminded of the stakes right before they started. You're on the money. Yeah, not reminding them that you're not supposed to be good at math as a woman. Not having that reminder in the front helped. And we're not making that myth up. You go online, there's a lot of places that claim women aren't as good as math, but a lot of it comes down to the framing.
And a little self-sabotage there.
And definitely a little self-sabotage.
Yeah, not feeling like you're good enough, even though you are.
So the takeaway for me in this, and I hope you follow along, Todd, I think for me that what this tells me is that playing not to lose is safe, and that's something we can learn from women. But playing to win is better when your odds aren't fantastic, which is something we can learn from men. And I think we can add both of those to our repertoire.
Absolutely. Kind of trade, right?
Right, exactly. So do you mind if I sort of interrupt our science talk and ask what happened to Motown? Because I'm sure I'm the only one here who has never heard of a little thing called Motown. No, everyone's heard of it. So,
well, over the course of its life, under the tutelage of Berry Gordy, Motown would produce 57 singles that would hit number one on the Billboard.
Wow.
Over 500 albums, and of course, countless side projects. The talent Berry Gordy helped mentor and compete with would literally shape American culture, which includes legends like Marvin Gaye, Temptations, Supremes, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, The Four Tops, Gladys Knight, Lionel Richie, Martha Reeves, and it just goes on and on and on. Neil Young, too. Do you know that Neil Young was a Motown guy?
I had no idea.
That's where he started. More than halfway through the documentary, you can see Berry Gordy and his partner, his competitor, Smokey Robinson, still competing with each other, Joe. And an argument started, and it was about who recorded I Heard It Through the Grapevine first. And they were both adamant about who did it. So Berry and Gordy, during this documentary, they turned to the crew, the camera crew. They stopped the show and said, "You guys got this on tape? Get on Google. Let's look this up. Let's get on my phone." And these two multi-millionaires, their net worth, I guess Barry's like 300-400 million. Smokey's like over 100 million. They pulled cash out of their pocket, the $100. They had a $100 gentleman's wager.
Wow.
You may be in competition already, whether you know it or not. Subconsciously, the majority of us are basing our wealth, our happiness, and our success on the relative success of our neighbors. That's not necessarily a bad thing either. The rival effect shows that pitting two people from similar abilities and educations against each other can improve the performance of both. Likewise, people get more competitive and score higher on tests if they think their competition pool is smaller, like the size of a small classroom or the size of a small recording studio full of artists. And if you're concerned that you're less of a warrior competitor and more of a worrier, well, you can worry a little less. Stress management and training can make you confident enough to go toe-to-toe with the warriors, creatively speaking. So remember, creativity benefits from competition, not diminishes it. Letting someone have a say in your process can be uncomfortable, and competition feels like a threat to your agency. But competition breeds a better product. It can force you to try new solutions, to pick up new skills, and to see through other people's eyes. In short, competition forces us to adapt and evolve. The old saying, not everything has to be a competition, is still true. But maybe the most worthwhile things can be. You've been listening to The Re-Engineered You. Thank you so much for listening to this show. You mean the world to us. We have a new episode every week.
You can connect with us at www.re-engineeredyou.com, where we have research links, show notes, and blog articles for every episode. We also appreciate feedback, and we love spirited debates.
We're not experts in anything, but we've got an opinion on everything.